Hello, welcome to another debate of the Friedrich Ebert Foundation in Washington, D.C., live from Washington, D.C. My name is Knut Detlersen, and I represent the Friedrich Ebert Foundation in Washington, D.C. and in North America. And we are very happy to have today a very exciting debate, discussion about the future of U.S. foreign policy under the incoming administration under Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. And this is our third debate after the historic election on 3rd of November this year. And it is no secret that social democrats around the world are excited about the result of the election. And that is why we look forward to working with the new political environment in the US. And democracy dies in darkness were the other words famously printed on every Washington Post since 2016. And we believe that continued dialogue can bring light into these times. And it is one of our great missions to foster dialogue. And we believe through dialogue and mutual understanding, we can, even in difficult times and with lots of challenges, find common ground. And of course, we believe also that the transatlantic relationship is crucial for our well-being, but also for the well-being of the world. And that's why we are very excited to have this debate today. And with the new administration coming in, we have first two members of parliament, members of Congress, and then other great guests who will join me later on in the debate. But first, let me welcome Congressman Brenton Boyle and Member of Parliament Niels Schmid from Berlin. Welcome to you two, and thank you for taking the time for being here today. Congressman Boyle represents the 2nd congressional district in Pennsylvania. He's a member of the House Committee on Ways and Means and on the Committee on the Budget. And in this context, he's also very much engaged in transatlantic relationship building and is also always ready for dialogue with German members of parliament. And he has also visited Germany several times. And we are very excited that Niels Schmid, also a member of parliament in Germany and the spokesperson on foreign policy for the SPD parliamentary group, is here with us today. I would like to start off with Congressman Boyle. After Joe Biden's election, Anne Hidalgo, the first female mayor of Paris, tweeted, "Welcome back, America, but are you back?" So can the US overcome the past 4 years of America first, anti-multilateralism, in a way protectionism and populism? So let's start. Thank you for being with us, Congressman.
Well, it's wonderful to be with this organization again, which I've had a lot of connection with over the last, I think, 6 years now, as I was just reelected to my fourth 2-year term in Congress last month. I would say that I am first and foremost optimistic that can happen. I am hopeful that it can happen. I am also realistic that it will not be overnight, that it will be a challenge. My goal, and I appreciate the introduction. One thing I'd like to highlight that I'm proud to be a member of is the Nato Parliamentary Assembly. And I imagine as part of our conversation, we'll talk a little bit about NATO, perhaps the single most important transatlantic organization that we have. And obviously has experienced some real difficulties over the last 4 years in the Trump era. But I said last year at a NATO Parliamentary Assembly gathering, one of the last gatherings, actually it was the last gathering we could have right before COVID hit, I joked to a friend of mine who's in the Bundestag, and I said, and yes, I'm just old enough to remember the TV show Dallas. And I said, do you remember Dallas, that they basically wiped away a whole 2 years by pretending the whole 2 seasons were just a dream, a bad dream. And if we are successful Democrats in the US in the 2020 election, my hope is that one day you will look back and we'll all look back at the Trump presidency and just think, did that really happen? Maybe I dreamt that. So I know, though, that will not happen overnight. It is a process, as I've mentioned, but I have no doubt that that is truly Joe Biden's goal. He talked about some of this at that great speech he gave in Munich, one of the few speeches he gave as a former vice president before he decided to run for president. And I think in many ways that was the outline of what you can expect a Biden presidency to look like with respect to rebuilding relations in Europe.
Mr. Congressman, thank you for that optimistic view. If I may ask, like, obviously there's a lot of speculation what a foreign policy of a Joe Biden administration is going to look like. So I would like to ask, what do you think are his 3 top priorities regarding foreign policy?
Yeah, so this is very fitting for our forum today. Number 1 is, no question, rebuilding the transatlantic alliance. He's talked about this a lot publicly. I've talked to him about it privately, going back close to a year ago now when we were in Iowa, which was pre-COVID. It was during the caucuses. Our elections, as you know, last forever. So back then, he was even talking about it. And I think that a major part of rebuilding the transatlantic relationship will be signaling again our strong support for Nato, which had always been a bipartisan kind of policy in the United States until Trump. If you look at it from Harry Truman and Dwight Eisenhower through Reagan and Clinton and up to Obama, you had 7 decades worth of bipartisan support for the transatlantic relationship and especially NATO. Then obviously Trump broke that apart. So that's number 1, rebuilding the transatlantic relationship. Number 2 is just between the Atlantic and the Pacific. And then, since you asked for 3, I would say
some 4 years ago at the Atlantic breakfast here in Berlin, and I'm glad that he's back in Congress and still very much engaged in favor of the transatlantic friendship. So I believe that there are lots of opportunities out there, but the basic point for me is that with the election of Biden, America is back as a partner and as a friend. For 4 years, we had a president in the White House who considered the European Union and European allies as adversaries, not as friends and partners. And this was the first case in point after World War II that an American administration rather endeared itself to dictators than cooperated with trusted allies. And so this is, for us, the most important outcome of the presidential election. We are playing in the same team now. We are defending the same values, as Brenton rightly mentioned. And there is a need to rebuild the traditional transatlantic alliance through NATO. But there's also a need for defending democracy and human rights all over the world. So I'm looking very much forward to the idea of holding a summit of democracy, which was spelled out by Joe Biden in his campaign and in his article in Foreign Affairs. I believe that this value-based foreign policy is very important. After all, over the last 70 years, we built an alliance on the basis of these common values. And although there might be some obstacles on the road, stumbling blocks, so we should not get too much unnerved by 2% goal, by Nord Stream 2 and all this stuff, but should rather focus on the broad basis for our transatlantic relationship and on our common security concerns, not only in Europe, but also in other parts of the world. So I believe that this is a very good start. And I attended the Munich Security Conference when Joe Biden spoke. And I'm glad that he's back and that the US is back.
Thanks. Can we just take a look also? We talk about international cooperation, and Biden does believe in international treaties, but Donald Trump left quite a few. So how can trust be rebuilt that treaties will actually last and the multilateral institutions have a future? So what treaties can be rebuilt and which treaties do have a priority? That question is for both of you. So if you could...
Brenton. I can, with Neil's okay, I can lead off, and then hopefully he can fill in anything that I inevitably miss. There are two obvious answers that immediately come to mind. One, which I think will be pretty easy, and the other I think will be more challenging. The first, there's no question that the United States will rejoin the Paris Climate Accord. As it won't surprise you, knowing that I'm center left in my political orientation, that I fully accept the science on climate change. I was proud of the fact that the United States under the Obama administration helped lead the formation and the successful culmination of the Paris climate talks. Certainly there were many naysayers who were quite skeptical that would be able to be reached. So I think it's quite clear that we will rejoin the Paris Climate Accord. And that can be done in our system actually fairly easily. Now, the second one is the one that I want to talk about that's a little bit less easy and more complex. And that is the Iran deal. What was the deal between the P5+1 and Iran? Obviously, that one is more complex. I do hope that we will be able to reach an agreement that includes the U.S., but I have to say, I believe that there ultimately should be a strong deal between the P5+1 and Iran. But I'm more realistic about this. I think there were challenges in the initial Iran deal. I welcome the recent comments, and I apologize, I can't recall the exact German official who made them, but talking about the sunsets issue specifically, as well as the remarkably malign behavior of Iran in the region, I do think it would be better if these things were addressed as part of the negotiations. So those are two pretty obvious areas that Joe Biden is going to look to rejoin. Again, the first I think is fairly straightforward. The second, a little more complex.
Niels, what would you like to add?
Yeah, I agree that the Paris Climate Protocol and the Iran deal are very important examples of agreements that the US should continue to support. In terms of multilateralism, we have also to think of different UN organizations. So we have the World Health Organization, which should be reformed, but still has a very important role to play. So I hope that the US will come back and contribute to modernize it. And then we have the World Trade Organization, where we have all the arbitration or appellate bodies of arbitration courts, which have to be reset. And I also hope for support from the Biden administration on that, because a rules-based order for international trade is part of our bigger multilateral system. And when it comes to Iran, let me just add one point. The official you probably alluded to, Brenton, was Heiko Maas, our foreign minister, who together with his French and British counterparts pleaded for a reinstatement or of the deal, but also for extending it to other malign activities from the Iranian side. And my guess is that you have to take the JCPOA as a starting point, because this has been negotiated over years and everybody was okay with that. But we have to add other things, sunset clauses and other points of friction in the region in order to bring in regional partners as well. So maybe we felt too comfortable and we were overconfident after concluding the JCPOA and forgot, or at least neglected, the other issues and did not invest the same amount of diplomatic capital or political capital after the conclusion of the JCPOA for reaching an agreement on the other issues as well. And this was a sort of overture or opening for fundamental critics of the JCPOA to gain some traction and to get some people on their side. And so we have to learn from that experience. But I hope that we can seize the opportunity of what we call a window of opportunity from January till the Iranian elections to make some progress on that. And then lastly, there's a more fundamental challenge, which I observe. I do not want to interfere into domestic policy matters in the US or constitutional matters, but from the Clinton time onwards, we've seen lots of several international agreements approved by the government, but not approved by the Senate. And this, of course, weakens the legal validity and the political strength of such agreements, because the government policy can be reversed by a change of the presidency, as we've seen under Trump. So just approving international agreements by executive orders is not as strong an endorsement of the multilateral order as an endorsement or a formal approval by the Senate. And sooner or later, in order to rebuild trust into the international position of the United States as a nation, as a leading nation in international relations, we should find ways to get Senate approvals for more of those international agreements. I believe that this is a very arduous task for American lawmakers, but for us as partners in Europe, this would be very welcome, of course.
Congressman, would you like to address that point or the question?
Yeah, it's a great insight. Part of the reason why Trump was able to do such damage in the environmental space, and I'm not just talking about Paris climate in this, I'm also talking about some US regulations. Donald Trump was able to do so much damage in the environmental space because a lot of the Obama policies were also by executive order and were by administrative decisions. He had to do that because after 2010, the Congress flipped Republican and wasn't able to get any legislation passed in these areas. So it made it easy, unfortunately, from my perspective, and I think our perspective, to then undo. Now you might think, well, why then isn't there more bipartisanship in the US? And that points to something that is a real difficulty at the moment, and that is the real extremism and even alternate worldview of the base of the United States Republican Party. In a forum like this, my instinct certainly, even though I'm a Democrat, my instinct is to attempt to be nonpartisan, to attempt to take my partisan hat off and look at things analytically. But I have to say, it would be a false equivalency to comment on US politics right now and say that the extremism within a certain element of the Democratic Party is anywhere close to what we see within the Republican Party. We now literally have two new cable news networks in the United States that are vying to attempt to be essentially the new Fox News and keep pushing an entirely unhinged, crazy conspiracy that Donald Trump somehow won this election, an election which he lost by 7 million votes, about 4.4%, not a landslide, but also not that close of a margin either. And the fact that that is gaining currency within a certain and growing segment of the Republican Party is deeply concerning. It's hard to achieve consensus in a pluralistic democracy if you have a certain segment of the population that is just getting their quote unquote facts from an entirely different source, not in any way attached to reality. So that is right now a uniquely American challenge. It's been growing and building over the last 20 years. And as I look out at the health, and I say this as a proud American who believes in our democracy, as I realistically look at the health of our democracy now and over the next couple decades, that is the single biggest thing that worries me. And it affects these other sort of issues that we've been talking about, such as the ability to reach the 2/3 threshold you need in the Senate to approve a treaty.
Indeed, what you analyzed is something that worries international observers obviously quite a bit, and it also makes it more difficult to trust in what is going to happen in the next 4 years, because there is, of course, the concern that what we invest in now might not last very long. But nevertheless, there is the NATO alliance, which is 70 years old. It celebrated its birthday, so to speak, last year. But there are also a lot of calls for reform. I mean, President Macron actually found very strong words when he analyzed NATO, calling it, if I remember correctly, brain dead. So if we look at NATO, like from a German and from an American perspective, like what would be the wish list of Joe Biden be, what he would like to accomplish within NATO? And what would Germany's preferences be when we look at NATO? So, Mr. Congressman, if I may ask you, since the US is obviously the strongest part of NATO to start, and then Niels Schmid will give the German perspective.
Yeah, well, thank you. I referenced the NATO summit I was at in London exactly a year ago, last December, and it was really the last big gathering we were able to have, because then COVID struck shortly thereafter. And at that time, as we were celebrating one another, those of us who are in the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, the sort of gallows humor at the event was, happy birthday, happy 70th. Will we reach our 75th? So that was kind of openly joked about. Now, at that point, a year ago, it was, some had the assumption that Donald Trump would win and then NATO would be done for. So I would say there's probably much more cause for optimism today than there was at that point a year ago. I do believe NATO will survive. I do believe we'll reach our 75th. But it then lends into the other question which you asked, and that is, all right, so what is the point of NATO? Macron made that, I think, unfortunate and overly harsh comment. Perhaps something was lost in the translation, because I don't think NATO is brain dead. But I think that there is perhaps an opportunity, putting it more positively, to figure out what exactly is our purpose for the 21st century. What exactly is our purpose in an organization that was built to combat first Soviet aggression, did that successfully for about 4.5 decades, but since that time has been grappling with, okay, why exactly are we here? One other thing I would throw out, and this is something that I'm wrestling right now, I'm the rapporteur of one of our committees within the NATO PA, and that is, does NATO play a role with respect to an ascendant China? Is NATO the proper format for that, or are we more just an organization to preserve peace and stability in Europe and just should stick within that? So I really look at the next, and especially the Biden administration, as a wonderful opportunity to reinvigorate the purpose of NATO and demonstrate that, having surprisingly gone through the last few years in which there were real questions about NATO survival, maybe all of us kind of rediscovered just how important NATO is to all of us. And perhaps we could look at this as maybe the beginning, ironically, the Trump year is the beginning of the reinvigoration and recommitment, reinvigoration of and recommitment to NATO.
Thank you. Niels, what's your view, or Germany's view?
Well, I agree with the general assumptions made by Brenton on the role of NATO. And I also hope that the NATO reflection process, which is going on and which has resulted in the first paper, will continue. And that in this context, we will also talk about the role NATO can play vis-a-vis China, not in formal terms, but in formal terms, the NATO treaty does not cover China in geographical terms, but still risk mapping and taking China's rise into consideration for our security is an important fact. I hope that now that the adults are back in power in Washington, we have also the opportunity to talk more about arms control, that arms control should be back on the agenda because European security has been neglected, and lots of arms control agreements have either been given up or are on the verge of being disbanded. And so we Europeans, we feel sort of orphans of arms control. For decades, arms control talks centered on European security. Now everybody in Russia and the US looks towards China, but still there are security issues and arms control issues left back in Europe, and we have to deal with them. And then we have, of course, to discuss to which extent this famous 2% goal is the right measure to define the member states' contribution to defense and burden sharing. Maybe the economic crisis following the pandemic can show us that we need more appropriate measures for that. And with every year that we come closer to the year 2024, which was the date set in Wales at the famous NATO summit, stipulating the 2% goal, we may also be able to overcome this debate and to find other ways of dealing with that. And then there's a last point I would like to make, and I would also like to speak out my gratitude to Congress and especially to the Democrats in the House of Representatives. That is the role US troops play in Germany. So, you know, my district is just 1 mile away from AFRICOM and EUCOM in Stuttgart. And I was really glad to see and to read that Democrats in Congress pushed for a more moderate and more reasonable approach towards the future role of US troops in Germany. And I can assure you that US troops are very much welcome in Germany. And I visited AFRICOM and EUCOM just 1.5 years ago, or 1 year ago. And every soldier I spoke to was so glad to be in Germany. They just like living in Germany and working in Germany. And I hope that the idea of punishing Germany by withdrawing US troops is now definitely off the table. And I really very much appreciate that.
Thank you, Niels. Mr. Congressman, would you like to say a few reassuring words regarding troops in Germany?
Yes, well, thank you, Niels. I actually was one of the members of Congress who worked on that and added my name to it. I also was in Stuttgart. I didn't realize I was in your constituency, but I was there about a year ago, a trip that Speaker Pelosi and a group of Democratic members of Congress took. It was primarily to the UK and to Ireland to talk about the Brexit issue and our strong commitment to the Good Friday Agreement and making sure that didn't become collateral damage. But I bring this up because our first stop on that trip was indeed to Stuttgart and to AFRICOM. And so I also heard exactly the same things from those soldiers, just how happy they were to be there. I think it is it would be asinine for the U.S. to pull its troops out just because Donald Trump wants to punish Germany because he has such personal dislike for Angela Merkel. It's so incredibly petty. I'm glad that Congress was able, on a bipartisan basis, actually, though led by Democrats, to stop him. It's also a reminder, too, and this can sometimes be, I know, frustrating for international observers, but in our system of government, Congress is a co-equal branch. And so the fact that we were able to push back against the Trump administration and ensure he didn't do something reckless or irresponsible about a sudden troop pullout of Germany is, I think, real success of Congress over the last several years.
Thank you very much, Mr. Congressman, and thank you very much, Niels. We would like to open up the conversation now because we have three other great guests, and I would also like to say friends, and who I invite to join now the discussion. It is Naz Derekoglu, it is Rachel Rizzo, and Matt Duss. I will introduce them, but I know you are very busy and you might have to leave. So I would like to say thank you very much for being part of this debate. If you can stay, it's great. We would welcome that. If you have to leave, that's also fine. So.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll be able to stay for a little bit because I am anxious. I would love to hear some of this, but then I do have to hop off.
Okay, so I would like to introduce Naz Derekoglu. She is a transatlantic policy expert, and she's a senior national security advisor with Senator Jane Shaheen from New Hampshire, and she manages democratic issues and activities on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and on the Senate NATO Observer Group. So welcome, Naz. Thank you very much for being here. Then we are very happy to also have Rachel Rizzo. I believe she was a Bosch Fellow in Berlin lately, but right now she's a fellow at the Center for New American Security, and she very much focuses on European security and NATO and the transatlantic relationship in general. So thank you very much for being with us today. We very much appreciate it. And last but not least, Matt Duss, the foreign policy advisor of Bernie Sanders, but also a commentator and speaker at many transatlantic panels. And he served as a director of the Foundation for Middle East Peace and speaks often on Middle East issues and is a partner of the Friedrich Ebert Foundation. Thank you very much for being with us, Matt.
Thank you.
I would like to start maybe with Naz, if I may. After 4 years of Trump, we live in a way in a divided world. Look at how many countries voted for nationalist, populist, and maybe even corrupt governments. Think of Brazil, think of Turkey, or even Hungary in the EU. So how can Joe Biden, or better yet, the transatlantic community stop the erosion of democracy internationally? What would be your take on that, Naz?
Well, thank you. To the question, I actually would agree with what Congressman Boyle said earlier in your discussion, that I think there will be a definitive tide change with President-elect Biden. However, it will likely take some time. So I think our allies have to understand and exercise some patience with that. But to your question about the degradation of democracy across the transatlantic alliance, I think, President-elect Biden, he was previously Vice President Biden, and I think he has a pretty strong record of actually physically going to places that are suffering from this issue with democratic backsliding, and also addressing it in his own speeches and policies here in the US. So I suspect that just being able to have this discussion once again with our transatlantic partners is already going to be a huge tide change and a huge difference from the previous 4 years and what we've seen. And further to that, I think one of the things that we have seen across the current administration is increasingly lowered amounts of foreign assistance, as well as a degradation of our diplomatic tools and our diplomats around the world. I think once Vice President-elect gets in, and I know this is the hope of my boss and of others, we do want to see the reprioritization of diplomacy and of foreign assistance and the tools that the United States can use to actually build up those segments of populations around the world that are fighting for democratic values and fighting against corrupt leaders and some of those which you've mentioned. So I do think that you will see a tide change, and I think it'll be very much based in a reprioritization of issues and recommitting the United States to the very foundational values that it believes in.
Thank you. Matt, may I ask you, Tom Wright identified two fractions among Democratic centrists, the restorationist and the reformist, and the first favoring kind of traditional means of diplomacy and the post-Cold War order, and the other in favor of fundamentally changing the US foreign policies. And now looking at China and the Middle East, what do you think Joe Biden is in favor of?
Well, I think, Joe Biden, if you look at the first kind of group of nominees or choices for his national security team, it can tell us a lot in the direction he's going to go. I mean, his speeches and his articles, particularly his foreign affairs article of a few months ago, I think gave a good rundown of the approach he's going to take. But here, I would pay particular attention to the choice of Jake Sullivan as national security advisor. And I think the remarks that Jake made at the announcement of these nominees about the importance of reconnecting American foreign policy to the American middle class, the American working class, basically rebuilding a sense among Americans of how foreign policy is working for them. And I think that is very, very key. That's going to apply. I mean, even we can can go down a list of priorities, climate change, China, Middle East, but I think underlying all of this is the project of rebuilding an actual enduring consensus in American politics that can form as the foundation for a foreign policy going forward. I think about what Congressman Boyle said a few moments before we joined the panel about polarization, about the fact that we've got factions in this country, some of whom are fed on these kind of alternative facts. This is a real challenge. It's not a challenge in the United States alone, but it's a real problem for the divisions and polarization in our politics. And I think the project of coming to some kind of shared understanding, a shared political compact, is going to be one of the foremost challenges for the Biden administration on a whole range of policy areas. But I think it has particular salience for foreign policy in kind of restoring or starting to restore some measure of trust amongst our partners and allies that the word of the President of the United States will endure beyond just that one presidency.
And how can that be done, Matt? How can that consensus
well, do you have a few
built?
minutes? No, I think part of it is having, first of all, recognizing the problem, which I think they do. I think Donald Trump's election showed that on a number of policy fronts that what's believed to be in Washington and many European capitals as the unassailable consensus about the post-war order is in fact quite assailable. There are a lot of people who have very serious questions about, does that order serve them and their family? How is that order benefiting them? When people gather at fancy resorts to talk about global issues, how is that advancing the interests of the American working class, the American middle class? And I think recognizing that we really have to engage with those questions seriously is an important first step. And I think the Biden administration is taking that.
That's probably something we have to do not only in the US, but Rachel, if I may ask you, you've spent time in Berlin, talked to many people, and you work on the transatlantic partnership, and which has been steadfast for 7 decades, but somehow it's getting shaky. What would you expect from Germany in terms of NATO and EU leadership to further strengthen the alliance? And what do you think of this idea of a New Deal? Is that something that can really be done? What could be new about the transatlantic relationship? Or is it just the same old, which basically does not affect many people emotionally and exactly does not connect to the, let's say, voters in Germany or the US?
Yeah, so I think you touch on a couple of really interesting points. I think there's no question that over the last 4 years, Donald Trump has shown his disdain for the EU, like the European project he thinks was created to, undermine the United States, and it was in direct competition with the United States. And for some reason, a lot of that disdain has been pointed at Angela Merkel. And I think that comes down to Germany not spending 2% of its GDP on defense. It comes down to trade deficits. And so I think that going forward, we would hope and I think expect to see the Biden administration not only just focus on repairing the transatlantic relationship in general, but also repairing the relationship with Germany in particular, because I think it's been so heavily damaged over the last few years. Now, Congressman Boyle, I think, mentioned the Munich Security Conference in 2019, and we all remember Biden's speech there when he said, "We will be back." I think that it's important to not confuse the phrase "we will be back" with "things will go back to the way they once were," because I think that looking forward, the transatlantic relationship is going to have to look different than it's looked over the past 7 decades, or especially after the Cold War. And I think a lot of that is going to be determined by how Germany acts within the European continent going forward, and what leadership position it takes within both the EU and NATO in particular. I think the Biden administration will expect Germany to continue increasing its defense spending. And I think in order to take on the leadership role that is expected of it within Europe, I think that's going to be really important. I think we've seen Germany do a great job within the COVID-19 pandemic and has really shown its leadership abilities within the European continent there. And so I think that the US can actually take some points from German leadership, and we can expect the Biden administration to look to Germany going forward as we hopefully get ourselves out of this pandemic. But I think that in order for the relationship to be repaired, and in order for it to be as powerful as it is able to be, and I think as a lot of us want it to be, it's going to be heavily dependent on how Germany acts and the role that it takes within the next couple of years. And so I think that's something that we're going to be looking closely at.
All right. So, but Niels, can I just bring you back in? First of all, I would like to hear your take on the defense spending, which was basically not a question, but something that is, of course, somewhat in the debate. I think it's actually a very important part. But also, Europe itself is, despite maybe some progress, facing very hard weeks right now. Also with COVID-19, but also internally when it comes to Brexit and its aftermath on negotiations over trade, borders, and free travel. And a question that is, of course, also out there: how can Biden be an ally for both the UK and the EU? How's that going to work out? Let me first ask Niels, and then someone maybe from the American side can jump in on that. Niels.
Well, I guess the Brexiteers in the UK just overestimated the UK's role and overestimated what they could do on their own on the world stage. So it's up to them to solve that problem. For us, it's very clear: Brexit is a bad thing. We should have this Brexit agreement. We should care for the very specific interest of the Republic of Ireland. But for us, Brexit is not so much an issue. It's up for the Brits to decide that. And if they want to leave without an agreement, then we will sustain it better than they will do that. But it would be a very bad idea. But there's also a sentiment of being fed up with all that Brexit stuff here in Berlin. So what is of great interest to me as a foreign policy expert is how to organize European security between the European Union and the UK. Unfortunately, there are not so many ideas out there in London for that purpose. There's one thing that is clear: they do not want to have a formal arrangement because they feel or they fear of being treated as not equal in a relationship, in a formal relationship with the European Union. So my best bet would be that we should try to create a sort of European Security Council, or that we should just elaborate further on the E3 format to tackle issues of international policy and to coordinate between the EU or individual members of the EU and UK on the in international relations. When it comes to the 2% goal, you know, we spend more on defense than France does. And our military procurement agencies are not capable of really spending this money because there are so many inefficiencies, bureaucratic impediments. And at the same time, we do not want just to buy American military stuff, because we have to care for our European weapons industry, and we have also to regroup and restructure, and so in a way also harmonize European defense industries across the borders. And so for me, the 2% goal does not express too much about how we organize defense in Europe. With the GDP numbers going down in all European countries, and most probably also in the US, Germany will sort of come closer to the 2% goal without spending €1 more on defense. So this is just an example of how narrow-minded the focus on the 2% goal is. We need a broader debate about burden sharing, about capabilities, also about taking on more responsibilities by Europeans, including Germany. But we've seen over the last few years that there has been a push for more engagement and involvement by Europeans and by Germany in particular. Just take Libya, or take Belarus, take also Ukraine, because the Normandy format is a strictly European format with no formal US involvement. So I guess we are on a good track, and we have to go on that way. And we also need the US as a partner. Sometimes when it comes to the European neighborhood in the former Soviet Union or in the Mediterranean, the EU will have to lead, but we need a partner in Washington that does not just do the opposite, as Trump did in the Western Balkans, for example. And when it comes to Turkey, we need also a stronger involvement from Washington, from the US side, because when sanctioning Turkey could be easier done with the help of Washington. So I would suggest that NATO should redefine its goals when it comes to defense spending and building up capabilities, and Europe should be more willing and more ready to invest more in security in its immediate neighborhood, and then this could be a good basis for the future of our transatlantic relationship.
Thank you, Niels. So I would like to just focus for a second somewhere else, and I would like to bring in a few audience questions that we have received before, and maybe I can ask Matt a question that was posed by Stefan Diebig from the Left Party in Germany. He is the foreign policy spokesperson, and I believe he's also a committed transatlanticist. And he asked the simple question, what about Afghanistan? And that is, of course, something that I have to admit I'm also concerned about. For those of us who have been in foreign policy for a very long time, we still remember how it was with no involvement in Afghanistan. If no one was there, involve, like intervention in Afghanistan or war in Afghanistan has also not really made things better, at least not in the long run. So what do we do, or what will Biden do about Afghanistan? Withdraw completely and leave it to itself, or is there another plan?
I mean, I think first off, you've seen an important commitment from President-elect Biden and from the party itself in the Democratic Party platform to end the forever wars. Now, that's a broad term, and there's a lot of space in there, I think, for some detail. But in general, I think there's an understanding on both parties. I mean, Donald Trump himself pledges to end endless war, even if he does the opposite. But I think there's at least an understanding by both parties that Americans are exhausted from some of these long-term interventions. The Afghanistan war is the longest war in America's history. And, you know, we've got sons fighting now whose fathers fought in Afghanistan. We've got people fighting there who were not born when the September 11 attacks happened. So I think that's the kind of political environment they're operating in now. I think they've signaled that they're not going to just quickly draw down to zero. They're going to remain engaged. They're going to do this withdrawal in a way that is responsible, that kind of, you know, works with allies and tries as well as they can to coordinate this with the Afghanistan government. It remains to be seen what comes of the current talks with the Taliban and whether it's possible to integrate some of this into the broader withdrawal project. But I do think they had the experience, during the Obama administration of feeling that they were kind of, in some ways, boxed in by the military into a larger surge in Afghanistan than they perhaps wanted to do. And Vice President Biden was among those who opposed that larger surge of U.S. troops. So I think he's coming from a place of more restraint on this question. But I think it's very safe to say that whatever decision is finally made, it will not be announced at 2 a.m. by a tweet. It's going to be something that's going to be considered and coordinated much more seriously with the allies and partners we've had fighting alongside us in Afghanistan for almost 20 years.
Rachel, thank you. That's Rachel. Can I ask you one question about Europe and the Biden administration? Do you think the EU and the Biden administration can find common ground on China?
Well, I think another important question is, can the EU find common ground on China? I think that look, China is becoming, I think, a much more salient point within the transatlantic partnership. The fact that I think the EU is sort of coalescing, hopefully, behind a shared approach to China is something that we should get behind. And I think that, Biden's approach to China is going to differ greatly than President Trump. And so I think that there's going to be opportunities for a deeper partnership on both sides of the Atlantic. And I think that the fact that Nato is talking about China now is a good thing, because I don't think it can be ignored. I think it's important not to go out in search of monsters to destroy, as the quote goes, but it's a conversation that I think has to be had, and it's important to have around the table at NATO. And so I hope that when it comes to China, the transatlantic partners, talk much more about technology, about 5G, and while there is going to be differences, I think, in the way that both the European continent and United States approach China, there's hopefully going to be some common ground that's able to be found. And I think it's not going to happen overnight. It's going to be a long road, and it's going to be, deep conversations that are probably going to bring to the surface some disagreements on both sides. But at the end of the day, those are conversations that must be had and conversations that will be had. I wanted to add one thing on something that Mr. Schmidt said. I completely agree that we need to rethink how defense spending works within the NATO alliance and how we approach it. I would love to do away with the 2% rule. I know that's not going to happen, but having a much broader definition of defense spending is, I think, completely necessary and would do us all a lot of good. So, side note, but something that I wanted to make sure that I said.
Richard, I actually think that it's a very important point, and maybe in one of the future discussions that we will have in a transatlantic level with some people involved, we can actually discuss, how do we define contributions to international security and stability. I think that is actually something very important, because the 2% goal is somewhat an arbitrary decision which does not necessarily reflect very well what a country contributes to security. Nas, can I ask you a different question, like more like about the inner workings of politics and policy in the future? I mean, how do you see the workflow on foreign policy, or also the cooperation, or maybe not cooperation, between the White House and Congress go forward? What do you envision there with your experience from the Senate side?
Definitely. That's actually a really interesting question, because under the Trump administration, I have to say Congress has taken up an increasingly active role on foreign policy, not just in terms of having hearings and writing legislation, but a number of foreign embassies, particularly member states of the EU, have been approaching congressional members about what's going on within the administration, what's actually going to happen next on really big issues. You know, Afghanistan was mentioned, but so many different issues. Congress ended up playing a much greater role. So I actually think that under the next administration, this is going to be an interesting rebalance between the legislative and executive branches on foreign policy. There is going to probably have to be a discussion on some of the legislation that, particularly on sanctions, that has pretty strict rules in terms of lifting sanctions. CATS is probably the biggest in this regard. How are we going to proceed forward where the equal branches of government continue to have a say on foreign policy, but I don't see the executive branch being as comfortable as the current administration is on letting Congress really kind of lead in these discussions and actually have such an active role. Of course, it'll be difficult to pry that role away from congressional members. So I think this is going to be something that's yet to be seen, but it will definitely be interesting for sure, because it's not something that I think anyone really has the answer for, but it's a complex question that needs to be tackled.
Thank you very much. Like, unfortunately, our time is like almost up. Now we are, Niels Schmid and Nas are left, the others had to leave. So I asked you like one last question to both of you to kind of wrap up this discussion. Like, what do you think? Will the Biden administration rely on Back to the Future revival as opposed to transformation of transatlantic ties and mechanisms for collective action? I mean, what do you, is there really gonna be something new? Is basically, I guess, the underlying question.
Well, I will say this. I mean, I think just based on everything that President-elect Biden has said and his advisors, his nominees have said, I think they're coming out of the gate reprioritizing multilateral diplomacy. And as much as this may seem basic to many of us in this space, it's actually somewhat radical given what we've seen in the last 4 years. And it's really, really important that this actually is a priority. And I believe it will be. So I think in terms of seeing a huge change and just kind of throwing everything out, I think you're actually going to more witness a change in tenor and a change in the ability to have dialogue with our partners, which it's basic, but it's absolutely necessary. And so there will be a healing process, I think, that you'll initially witness.
Niels, would you like to add a few last words to this?
Yeah, famous last words. So my guess would be that there will be a mix of both, back to the basics when it comes to NATO, alliances, multilateralism, democracy, and human rights. But there's also lots of space and opportunities for a fresh start. So Biden will be the first US administration that will actively engage in defining a common China strategy with its European allies. This is it's quite new because Trump just emphasized the trade war side of it and did it on his own. There's also a lot of space for new fields of cooperation in the field of economics and trade. So I do not see any going back to the transatlantic, the TTIP idea, but maybe there might be more cooperation on future technologies, pharmaceuticals, vaccines, artificial intelligence. So I guess that we should reconnect to this old idea of economic cooperation, but address new areas of economic and technology cooperation. So that's what my guess would be. Yeah.
So thank you very much. I would like to thank you. I would like to thank those that have been watching our debate on a new White House, a new foreign policy. I would like to thank our guests, in particular Naz Derekoglu and Neil Smead, who are still present, but also those that are not present anymore and had to leave, Rachel Rizzo and Matt Duss and Congressman Brenton Boyle. I think it was a very interesting debate. Time is short, but we tried to put in as many questions as possible. I hope you will stay in touch with the Friedrich Ebert Foundation in Washington, D.C. and join our future events that you will find on our website and also on our social media channels. And I wish you all the best, and I hope, of course, for a good start here in Washington, D.C. For the president-elect and his government, and also a good start for the new Congress, and all the best also to Berlin. And stay healthy, stay well. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.
Goodbye.